So thank you very much for inviting me to share the perspective on ethical practice in statistics and data science, which is statistics is definitely a discipline, data science may be a discipline, and there may be a nascent discipline called statistics and data science. Data ethics seems to be a thing. It's maybe a profession, maybe it's an area of focus or whatever. But so sometimes I use statistics, data science, and statistics and data science, and I don't remember what the slide deck has in it. But I am the current chair of the American Statistical Association Committee on Professional Ethics. I have been the chair since 2017. This is a committee you can only serve on for 2 consecutive 3-year terms, and my second term ends in December, so I'll be stepping down as the chair. When I joined the committee in 2013, I took over for somebody, so I ended up being on the committee for 7 years. We were starting the first ever revision of the ASA Ethical Guidelines for Statistical Practice. They were originally adopted by and approved by the American Statistical Association Board in 1995, so they had not been updated. The 1995 board-approved version was based on some thoughts of somebody. They were published in 1972, so they were not unchanged, but not particularly dramatically changed between 72 and 95. And in 2014, I chaired the working group on the revisions. They were approved in 2016. It was quite a dramatic revision, as the practice of statistics had changed pretty dramatically in those 30 years. But in 2018, there was a sexual harassment and sexual assault. I'm going to just go with scandal, but it was a very long-term, ongoing series of events, and we were asked to revisit the guidelines specifically to determine if we had left any loopholes, sexual assault is actually okay, or anything like that. Happily, that revision, that evaluation only took a few months. I chaired that working group as well. We didn't really find any glaring holes, but we did do a marginal revision in 2018. So the current version is 2018, and you can see those online. I think I have a URL here. So in the past, since 2019, so in the past 10 years, I focused a lot on research ethics and ethical practice of statistics. I am a statistician, and I'm also a cognitive scientist, and I think a lot about why people who use statistics resist us trying to teach them how to use statistics. They certainly resist us trying to teach them how to use statistics appropriately. So this is a cognitive problem that any faculty member who teaches introductory level statistics encounters. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about why it's such a problem. The Committee on Professional Ethics, or COPE, has a specific mandate to maintain and disseminate the guidelines. We don't adjudicate. So if an ASA member violates the guidelines and does it to you or with your data or something, you wouldn't be able to call the Committee on Professional Ethics for an answer or a judgment. Some professional guidelines do have that option. The Association for Computing Machinery, for example, does have that. And I've spent the past 9 months reading every single word of the Association for Computing Machinery guidelines, or its code of ethics, and comparing it to the ASA guidelines and the RSS guidelines and the American Mathematical Association guidelines. So I'm like, all guidelines all the time.
But not ISI.
ISI has 10 items, and so that is pretty quick. not super super intensive. But the ACM has 24 items, and the ASA, as you'll see, has 54 items. So these are important to understand the complexity of your guidelines and when they pertain. When can you use one? When would you use one and not the other? That's one of the problems with the dissemination, is I can't just hand out the guidelines because they're complex. The practice of statistics is complex, so ethical practice tends to be even more complex. We talked in the first session this morning about balancing goods or benefits and harms, but you also have guidelines articulating a responsibility to protect the public and the scientific community while you respect your client's wishes. So which one of those is prioritized? The RSS specifically states that you need to prioritize the client. It doesn't say you have an obligation to balance the client's needs with the public's needs. So that just happens to be the way the RSS code is stated. Again, because I've read them all 400,000 times, I'm like, oh my god, this word, you put and instead of but. So anyway, and I want to point out, so my slides are super dense. I might have a picture. I think I have a table. But they're annotated, and I will post them. So they'll be available on my website, so you can use them later. That's my whole MO when it comes to slides. Okay, so an important thing about the ASA Ethical Guidelines, or the guidelines as I'll call them, the ACM Code of Ethics has the same statement, and the RSS does not have the statement in their Code of Practice. But the ASA and the ACM both stipulate that if you use this technology or these methods, you are obligated to use them ethically. Now, of course, that is a huge problem for people who are not familiar with the guidelines, like psychologists or chemists, people who would never have the reason to look at ASA ethical guidelines. So as a person who chairs the committee tasked with dissemination, part of my challenge is to get everyone who uses statistics to understand that they have obligations. And not that they have guidelines, but they have an obligation to follow the guidelines. That's the key, is not just handing out the guidelines, but making sure that people understand that they have responsibilities to use the technology or the methods or the techniques ethically. So yeah, the ASA Ethical Guidelines apply to all those who analyze data, and that's stated in the preamble. The other aspect of the ASA Ethical Guidelines is just like the RSS, the ASA has federal statisticians, biostatisticians, which I am. We have actuarial statisticians, and then you have frequentist statisticians and Bayesian statisticians. So we have a lot of different practitioners, and the ASA guidelines represent professional ideals. So the ethical practitioner does the following. The virtue ethics approach is represented very strikingly in the ASA ethical guidelines, although they're not explicitly stated in these technical ethical terms. It's just all the guidelines happen to be put in this framework. They are guidelines, they're not rules, so they are intended to offer guidance when you're setting out to practice, or if you have a problem, knowing that you have a responsibility to the public and a responsibility to your client. Those are responsibilities you need to understand, and guidance isn't offered to say, well, the client always wins, or the public always wins. The RSS and the Association for Computing Machinery and the Data Ethics Framework do specify who the priority is. The public good should be prioritized in all decision making. The guidelines are intended to promote ethical science, so the statistical support for scientific innovation or whatever should be ethical, and all of the decisions that are based on evidence should all be based on ethical work. So this is just the background. The first published guidelines were in 1999, and then they were revised 2014 to 2015, and then in 2018. Of interest, the Royal Statistical Society and the Association for Computing Machinery require fellows in the RSS and members in the ACM to read and follow the guidelines. There isn't any statement like that in the ASA guidelines. So the ASA guidelines currently say something like, if you're ethical, you will follow these guidelines. But it doesn't say that you're obliged to follow them. The ACM in particular has a bullet point, principle 4, you must follow these guidelines, and you need to act to make sure other people follow these guidelines. And the RSS has something similar to that. I have tried to get the ASA guidelines to reflect that, and that I have not been successful. I'm the chair of the committee, and I was the chair of the working group both times, and I couldn't get that through. So part of the resistance I'm happy to discuss with anybody who has suggestions for how to get people to agree. part of the reason is people say they're guidelines, and we can't say, I suggest you follow these guidelines, because that's just circular and pointless. So it's not that people say, well, we shouldn't require people to follow these, because that's just dumb. That isn't the reason. It's just that it seems tautological to suggest people follow the guidelines and the guidelines. Anyway, so when we were doing our revisions, we focused on the fact that the guidelines are complex and we can't just hand them out to people. So amongst our dissemination strategies are when people sign up and they're paying their fee, in return we give them a receipt and the guidelines. So, okay, that does check the dissemination box, but it doesn't really do much more than that, and that's a problem for me because I'm literal. So one of the things that I've been doing is trying to figure out how to and this is a driving force behind the first revision, is when we were revising the guidelines, they had to be teachable. So if you came up with something of whatever, I can't even think of a good example of something that was just not teachable. Be honest. I mean, I can say, well, guideline principle number 1 is to be honest, but that is very difficult to teach and assess. But don't put your name on anything that you wouldn't stand behind is a way to make that sort of a very concrete behavior that you can sort of talk about and observe other people doing or not doing. And so that changes be honest to something that's actually much more teachable. So that was one of our focal points in the revisions in 2015. And in 2017, at the International Statistics Institute World Congress for Statistics, the Committee on Professional Ethics was invited to contribute to a discussion on whether or not the discipline of data science, if it ever becomes a discipline, needs a new set of guidelines go. So the ASA position was, no, we don't need new guidelines, which is where these slides came from, that the ASA guidelines cover professional practice parameters that work in data science as well as in statistics. But what's needed is widespread and effective training, not widespread training. So again, the guidelines exist to help statistics practitioners, who are defined as anybody who uses statistical methodology either every single day, every hour of the day, or once a week on data you got from somebody else, to make and communicate decisions ethically, and to inform those relying on statistical analysis, including employers, the standards that they should expect. The ASA guidelines, unlike RSS, ISI, and ACM, has a principle set aside for employers. If you're employing somebody to do your statistics, if you're an employer or a client or a lawyer, they are specifically called out as being required to allow the statistician to follow the guidelines and to promote that a permissive environment so that somebody is allowed to follow their own guidelines, and you should not ask a statistician to violate the guidelines. This is something that, I'm not sure if any of you saw this paper. It was published, I think, either late 2018 or 2019. It was a survey of American biostatisticians asking them, how many times a week are you asked to violate standards of practice for any, it's called plagiarism, fabrication, and falsification, FFP, are the 3 things you can lose your funding for in the United States, and that it constitutes scientific misconduct. So the survey questions were, how often, how many times a week are you asked to violate FFP or other practice standards, other ethical standards? And the answer was like at least once a day. So that was a really remarkable report, and the people who are asking statisticians to do that aren't statisticians, unfortunately. I mean, unfortunately, it's everybody who employs them. And then again, the ASA guidelines should guide both those whose primary occupation is statistics and other people who use statistics. So this is just a list of the areas in which the ASA guidelines have principles, and then there's how many specific elements are in each principle. So that adds up to however 52 or whatever. And then principles of employers, they have 8 specific attributes to creating an ethical culture within which statistical practice can be done effectively and ethically. Also, probably reflecting the academic orientation of a lot of the statisticians in the Committee on Professional Ethics over the past 30 years. Misconduct is this specific thing. So scientific misconduct is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. There are other discussions in the United States around statistical misconduct, like cherry picking, p-hacking, or hypothesizing after results are known, harking. Those are called disruptive research practices by the National Academies of Science in the United States. So these responsibilities regarding allegations of misconduct were driven by the FFP conversations everybody in academia has been having for the past 20, 30 years, but will probably be changing going forward. One of the biggest changes that we had in the 2014-15 revision was the board told the committee to please revisit the guidelines every 5 years from now on. So that's going to probably come up in the next revision. Okay, so the title of this talk was, why is the ASA, the only, it covers data science as well as statistics. So this is a graphic that I created. It's not to scale, but this is a Venn diagram. And utilizing the Data Science Ethics Checklist, which you can get at dion.org, and the Data Ethics Framework, which you can get at gov.uk, I created 47 vignettes capturing each of 7 tasks that any statistician or data science would do: plan, design, collect data, analyze data, interpret data, draw conclusions from data, communicate your results, and work on a team. So those are the context within which there are between 5 and 9 vignettes in each of those contexts. And the vignettes are things like, you observe a senior team member bullying another staff member, or someone asks you to cherry pick in your report and tells you not to report the negative results. Very, very simple vignettes, unfortunately, all of which have happened to me. So they're all authentic. Anyway, so the universe of ethical, statistical, and data science practice. I'm not a data scientist, but I was able to translate and confirm with somebody who is a data scientist that the vignettes were accessible in both context, statistical, and data science. So if you think about the universe of ethical practice, the ACM Code of Ethics covers a lot, and the ASA Ethical Guidelines cover a lot, and they overlap a lot. The Data Science Ethics Checklist covers some, and the Data Ethics Framework covers some, but they don't cover anything that isn't already in one or both of the other guidelines. So I said it's not to scale because the ASA Ethical Guidelines cover a lot more specific activities of these 7. Data analysis, data interpretation, and data drawing conclusions from the data are all explicitly called out in the ASA guidelines, and they're not at all in the ASA guidelines, ACM guidelines. But the ACM guidelines talk about creating systems that drive cars and can kill people or something like that, and obviously ASA guidelines don't talk about that. So there are areas of not overlap, and then it's a lot more that they do overlap. The ethics checklist and the framework can be helpful in addressing some of the problems in these 47 vignettes. The DEFW is relevant in 23 out of 47. The data science ethics checklist is only useful in 17. And when I say useful, I mean, what would the answer to this problem be? If somebody is bullying in your workplace, ASA has something to say about that specifically. Not only does it say don't bully other people, but it says if you observe somebody bullying somebody else, you can't just walk away from that. When you notice unethical behavior, you actually have to act as relevant for yourself in your role as possible to stop it. And the ACM says something similar. Neither the data science ethics checklist or the data ethics framework says anything about that, but these are things that actually happen. So in the sort of working on teams set of vignettes, neither the DSEC or the DFW have anything to say about what should you do if that happens to you. So that's a problem, but the guidelines in either ACM or ASA can help you with those problems. Okay, so here's the table. How did I determine that, you might be wondering. So what I did was I created tables like this. These are the 7 principles of the data ethics framework. And these are the ASA and ACM principles that address each of the questions. So of interest, if your team is using the data ethics framework from gov.uk and you want to answer question 1, how do you answer question 1? You can look to ASA principle A or B, but not D, E, or F, or C, or H. And ACM does not talk about starting with a clear user need. So you wouldn't get any guidance about how to do that, but you do get it from the ASA guidelines. And similarly, for being aware of relevant codes, I think D1 says that, and E1 says something specific to that, and so does 2.3 in ACM. So that's how this table was derived. And let's see, blah, blah, blah. Of interest, so I'm a professor, and so I think about training the next generation of statisticians as well as people who employ statisticians or people who are just taking the required single course in statistics. And talking about this is how you are ethical, or worse, you are not ethical, so please follow these guidelines so you will be, which I'm not sure if you've ever tried that, but does not go over well, so I wouldn't recommend it as a strategy for teaching ethical habits of mind. But talking about professional practice, what does it mean or look like to be a professional? And particularly when I talk to people who are about to go into the workplace, so they're in an internship or in a capstone experience and they're about to get jobs, challenging them to describe what it would look like if the people you work with were ethical practitioners. How would you recognize those people? So talking about what it looks like to be ethical, so to be an ethical practitioner, so you can show that to a future employer and ask for that from a future or potential employer, that's a better selling point than, wow, you should really be more ethical. I don't think you're very ethical. But talking about the habits of mind or what characterizes the ethical quantitative practitioner can be helpful. So barriers to promoting the guidelines, as I mentioned, not all ASA members know them or know about them. They don't even know that they exist. Not all people who practice any kind of quantitative science at all know about the ASA. They don't know about these guidelines. And there is a problem saying, well, if you're not in the ASA, these guidelines, they don't apply to me. And the ASA has a problem getting past that. So this is a barrier. And so helping people to understand that it's not dues paying that makes you ethical, it's following these guidelines that makes you ethical. That's actually a challenge. And compliance and ethics in the United States is sort of the driving force that if what I'm doing is good enough to check that box, then why should I bother doing something complex, even if it's going to ultimately be better? So that is a challenge. As long as you comply and don't hire bad apples, and I promise you that people have actually told me, we don't hire bad apples here. So I don't need your guidelines, or I don't need to learn anything about ethics. And when people say ethical behavior is just common sense applied to the workplace, which is a direct quote from the Office of Research Integrity Director in the late 2010s. Late 2000s. That is ineffectual and old-fashioned, and I'm going to go with absurd. Okay, so cultural promoters, engagement with the guidelines, even if you're not unethical, knowing these guidelines can help promote an ethical workplace and enable and empower people to have conversations about, I observed this, should we do something about that? That conversation is a hard conversation to start, and you need practice initiating that conversation. Changing the conversation about ethics training so that people sort of focus on being a professional rather than not being bad or not being seen as a bad apple. That's a really important thing. And adding these guidelines to every course that includes quantitative content, I think, is something that is really important for the committee. These are just a few important points that practitioners should acknowledge that ethical practice is not common, so it's certainly not common sense. That's just stupid. When people say stupid things, it's hard to say, what? Dude, you just said that out loud, but we need to stand up and say, that's that's not, especially if they're in leadership role. And then also considering that what we do as faculty, at least, and when we mentor people on research teams, has real and lasting effects on the professional identity formation of the junior people or the students in our communities. That's a really important responsibility that we need to focus on. Employers and end users need to be aware of and insist on their right to competent ethical practice, and employees should also recognize that. So, in closing, this is the main point here. Professional ethics isn't something that comes to you because you pay dues. I mean, I can't even say that loudly or enough. I can't say it often enough. But it's all, the twin is, I have a PhD in statistics. Of course I'm ethical. That's just crazy. So, and again, these are all authentic quotes from people, because this is only 10 years. It's only been 10 years, and I have a million of these. So for a little tequila, I'm willing to share. But yeah, and so my position is everyone who uses data, if they use evidence to make decisions or data specifically to make decisions, you should be insisting that the people follow this kind of framework in their practice and promoting it in your whatever workplace or organization. So that should be it, and we have time for questions.
Yeah, maybe there's like a couple of people have a couple questions?
Yeah.
I was hoping you might have a success story, because I'm faced with people telling me that, well, I think it's the best, this is Deloitte. They've asked to do an independent review of some work. And they said, oh yeah, they're best estimates. So I said, how did you know they're best estimates? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, we asked Jeff. And by the way, we forgot to put in our report that Jeff, whose work we are reviewing, is a friend of ours. Okay, so that, I'm afraid, it's nice to see Deloitte sponsoring us. Mm-hmm. And I'm up against things like that. Well, this model doesn't have any assumptions other than the calculation of age.
And that everyone's a man.
And when I wrote to the RSS and said, look, this is your code of conduct, I'm a CSTAT, what support will you give me? They said, oh, maybe you should just resign.
Yeah.
So what does the ASA say if somebody asks? Do you say, oh, just resign?
Well, if you ask me, I would say yes. You need to sort of think about where you want to work. And I think...
No, but of course if you resign, what you're doing is simply leaving people.
Right.
Carry on.
No, yes, absolutely. No, you're right.
Carry on giving independent reports about their friends.
You're right. So I think the response, so first of all, I'm not an adjudicator.
Yeah.
And the challenge that you're describing happens quite a lot, where people say, so I'm an editor for PLOS One. When I get reviews, I'm an adjudicator at PLOS One. So people will say, here's 5 reviews, and they all say, I don't know what's going on in the statistics part here, but everything else looks great. And the editorial board says, can you weigh in on these conflicting results? The decisions that are recommended to the editor are accept, with a minor revision, that a study was done. But we just can't confirm that. But what do you think? Yeah, I swear to God, it happens like monthly, but I'm on sabbatical, so it hasn't happened since January. Anyway, so the question is, why are those people allowing, how can they still be reviewers when they're clearly not supporting good science being published? So what you're talking about in Deloitte, in this reviewing context and peer review context, you can't review somebody at your own company's work. So there's that, but that's the only difference. So unfortunately, A, no success stories, and B, what you're describing happens everywhere, and it's up to people who are immune from being fired or replaced to make a stand, and that is what I try to do as an editor, and when people come to me for whatever role I have where there is adjudication, I do try to point these out for federal agencies I consult with, but you have to make a coherent argument. You can point to the guidelines, but it has to go before a thoughtful reader, and those people are rare. So the answer is we're screwed, but we have to keep trying. Do you know what I mean? It's you can't give up. So for younger people, I say you're going to have an exit interview. So you should say Jeff is trying to defraud the investor, and I can't be a part of that. oh, by the way, here are the guidelines. And then go to your new, better job. That's what I tell junior people who they don't have a voice. But for people who are not junior, who do have a voice, my recommendation is write it up and send a letter to the editor, or you want to be, especially if you can't be harmed in retaliation, it's really important for us to be heard as not standing for that. Yeah.
Those who are engaged in federally funded research of human subjects in the USA are expected to follow a set of guidelines which has become known as the Common Rule.
Right.
The Common Rule has been revised recently,
2017.
referenced particularly to IRBs, Institutional Review Boards, for the beginning of this year. What confidence do you have that those who sit on institutional review boards will follow the ASA, ASM guidelines?
So that is a great question. My answer is none at all. That is based on my experience being on IRB and other review boards where, when the statistician is asked for their input, if it is, this study cannot be, there is no endpoint. The power calculation doesn't make sense. The 40 people you have put at risk with this intervention, their data will be wasted because that cannot be replicated. Whatever you're talking about is not going to work. The chair of the committee says, but it's already been funded. So your comments don't matter. Again, I can't tell you how many times that happened. That is an actual quote. So IRBs are not trained to read or process statistical material at all. And that's the crux of the study design. I have zero faith in IRBs to understand the implications, the threat that you're putting patients at risk or animals at risk, and you're not going to get interpretable results.
But IRBs are at the crux of the Common
Absolutely,
Rule.
100%.
So what you're saying is there's a fatal flaw
That is
in
correct.
the Common Rule.
But when a statistician says, yo, NIH, that's all you get, they hang up. So that's the end of that conversation. However, the ASA, Committee on Professional Ethics, has initiated an initiative to promote these guidelines and an emphasis on statistical literacy in the responsible conduct of training that every single person who is trained with federal money will receive. Right now, all they talk about is making sure consent is informed, which as a cognitive scientist, I can tell you, is a construct with no foundation. So if they moved on to statistical misconduct as well as scientific misconduct as a focal point in training, then nobody would end up on an ethics or an IRB board who hadn't at least had that, understanding cherry picking and understanding p-hacking and possibly study design, but I mean, that's like a wishing on a unicorn. So yeah, 100% the sad, sad face. I'm sorry, I have no happy stories. Yeah.
I was going to say, just following that, I think the medical ethics committees that we have in this country don't have statisticians on all. They're not obliged to. It's sort of like a desirable option.
Right.
They have a lot more power. I mean, they're not perfect.
Yeah.
But I've certainly, as a statistician, both on journals and on grants, killed things. So there's no way you can fund it and be listened to. So I think, progress has been made.
Being an authoritative voice without, in a place where that is actually honored and heard, that's a super hard context to be in. And we all need to seek out those opportunities and have all the conversations to try to get those people on those committees who will listen or at least say, there might be a design question here, why don't we ask a statistician?
Yeah.
Said no one ever on an IRB that I've ever heard of.
I mean, I was quite, well, what I said on my what used to be an MREC, Multi-Centre Research Ethics Committee, were respectful of what I said about it, but the fact is that I don't think all of them had a statistician. That is a problem, and they weren't sort of funded or anything like that, so it's just like it's an optional extra, and that seems crazy, as you say, with people at risk,
Yep, I totally agree. But one of the things that is a problem, there's two problems that could easily be addressed by a wider dissemination of this information,
Yeah.
you have a responsibility. If I say no, somebody says, will you design this study for me? And I say, like I did 6 months ago, a study with 10,000 people in it, because that's how many you need to see the effect size, that is a dumb study. You're putting 10,000 people at risk to potentially, whatever the answer, however that sentence is, doesn't matter. She could have gone down the hall. Luckily, she didn't have time. So she had to listen to me because I was one of the listed mentors on her grant, but she could have gone down the hall to somebody who said, sure, if you've got money to do a 10,000 person trial, I'll design it for you. Because I'm saying guideline 4 says, if it's ridiculous, don't do it. The person down the hall may not have ever seen the guidelines, or they got it in exchange for their dues, as a part of their receipt and did not read them. So getting people, everyone, to see that they have a responsibility is super important. So there's a real role for education, undergraduate and graduate and postgraduate and professional. And then whoever has a voice needs to use it whenever they talk to people. You are asking me to do something that is contrary to the international accepted guidelines for ethical scientific practice. She said, sadly. And then was booted, right?
Yeah.
So I should introduce myself. My name is Patrick Lee. I'm an actuary and I'm on the council of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. But I'm also a member of the Joint Data Science Focus Group that we set up about a year ago with the Royal Statistical Society to look into developing guidelines for professional use of data science. I'm an actuary, but I'm also passionate about new technology. And over the last 2 years, I've taken 3 Microsoft professional programs. The first one was in data science, then one in big data, and one in artificial intelligence.
You said Microsoft, authored by Microsoft.
Yes, I mean, they used to call them degrees, but they're shorter. There are 10 courses, for example. So the data science one, the artificial intelligence one was 10 courses, including 1 on ethics. So, they get credit for
Wow.
that.
Gold star.
The 3 programs had something like 27 courses with some overlap. So there's 1 out of 27, if you like, on ethics. But it was good. I liked it. And that was one of the early ones, so credit for that. So we partnered about 2 years ago with the Royal Statistical Society to try and, because we have things in common, professional attitudes, and trying to use statistical methods in the use of business decision making. So I'll talk about the partnership and how the guidance developed. We tried to condense it into 5 themes that would be easy for people to remember, and on the basis of principles-based guidance rather than lots and lots of things. We have a problem as well, as everyone does, with people not necessarily following things and reading things maybe once and then. So if we can get 5 themes that are more memorable, we hope that it will stick. And I was struck by Rochelle's slide where she said that it's not something you just get a vaccination for and that you can then forget. It's like learning, it's lifelong learning. You have to keep sort of thinking about it and revisiting it. So again, a simple set of themes should help with that. We have some example practices for embedding the ethics into the projects and a checklist, and it's going to be launched in just over a month's time at the Royal Statistical Society's Errol Street offices in London. So a bit more on that. And I hope we'll have some time for questions about some things that exercise me at the moment about ethics and artificial intelligence and the future. So the partnership, we wanted to explore the practical and ethical implications of this new field of rapidly developing data science. We've got things in common. We've got expertise, experience, and strong professional values. And we've got, most importantly, a shared commitment to public interest. So that's the RSS Data Science section, which Leone's on, and also Giles. So we had those 2 from the RSS side, and we had 3 actuaries. I think we had a 3rd person on from the RSS originally, but she's not been able to do it due to other commitments. And we had meetings every sort of 3-4 weeks for quite a while, usually by phone, and alternate chair. So it's very much a partnership. But before that, we had I'm sure you're familiar with the RSS features. So it's supporting good practice, best practice. And we came together because it's much more common now to use data science methods. They're supplanting older methods. So it changes the work of our members who work in insurance or pensions and increasingly in wider fields like banking and industry, where statisticians have always worked in wider fields. So we wanted to provide practical guidance that would complement existing guidance. We have lots of, we have an actuaries code. We also have, we're subject to regulations, technical actuarial standards from our regulator, the Financial Research Council, the FRC. But again, it's the idea of having some high-level principles. So our approach was similar to Rochelle's. We looked at, well, we had workshops before that, before I come on to the guidance principles. We had workshops across the UK last year, focusing on 4 key questions. The first one was, what does a good data science workflow look like? Then, what do the decision makers, the executives and managers need to know about data science? What is a data scientist's responsibility to wider society? And how do you actually get data science, how do you get good data science embedded into the structure of an organisation? So the key findings from those workshops was it's not simple. It depends on the industry you're in and the availability of skills and the way things have been done in the past. You have to start from where you are. But we did have some high-level agreement on some of the questions. And we wanted to build on that, so we set up this joint focus group to try and generate these guiding principles. And we focused on the findings from 2 key questions, the data scientist's responsibility to society and good data science workflows. So we looked at different frameworks like Rochelle has done. So we looked at things like the Future of Life Institute, the ASA principles, Google's principles for ethical use of artificial intelligence, Microsoft as well, the UK's House of Lords code on AI, the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, the DCMS, the one that Rochelle's referred to, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, Metrolab, AI Now, the Association for Computing Machinery, which I mentioned, and Machine Intelligence Garage. And we tried to condense, to look at what's common, try and distill from that 5 principles. So we've got a draft guide which is going through its final stages. We're currently having a few tweak discussions with the regulators, so which we hope will all be ironed out by the 7th of October when it's launched. So the guide has 4 elements. There are these 5 key themes which we hope will be easy for people to remember and practices to help put those into work. And there are checklists for people to look at when they're doing projects. And we'll be adding references to the resources for people who want to learn more. So the first theme is try and use AI for good, because the idea is that AI we're told it can be very, very powerful. I actually convinced of that. And therefore it can be a force for great good. If it can be a force for great good, it should be. If we're ethical, we should take advantage of that. And the benefits should ideally be shared widely in the public interest. So we don't want it to go to, say, 50% of the population. If there's huge economic growth over the next 20, 30 years from AI, it would be wrong if as a society, we didn't help everybody be lifted up by that. So examples of practices that can be used to help that. We should consider the potential impact that models will have on decisions, especially in relation to the impact on people. And we should always be seeking to act in the public interest. A relevant quote for that, the late Stephen Hawking said that the rise of AI, powerful AI, could be absolutely the best thing that could happen to us, or it could be the worst. And we just don't know which. That was a couple of years ago. So it's up to us, I think, to try and make it be the best. Now, the downside of that, of course, is AI can be used for bad as well. So it could cause great harm. So this second principle is, don't just think about the people you're doing good for with the work. There might be other people who are harmed. Don't forget about those. So we need to take great care to avoid doing harm by working in a way that respects the equality, autonomy and privacy of individuals and groups. And as Rochelle has mentioned, we should speak up when we realise that there's potential harm in an AI model that's being built, or ethical violations are happening. So, as an example, practices, we should be using data that's ethically sourced. So, for example, where data subjects have knowingly given their data and the perception of data subjects have been considered, and that's not always easy, as you referred to, but we should do our best for that. And we should think about privacy and ethics in the work as well as our legal and regulatory requirements. We should try and embed ethical risk management into the work culture, so it's not just something that's bolted on, it's thought of at all stages. We should educate the workforce to recognise the risks for harm and unfairness. Now, you mentioned that. Educate the people coming into the organisation to say, hang on, that doesn't sound right, this is not the kind of organisation I want to work for, where something seems unethical. And we should be considering the impact on the environment and its resources. The third theme is, as you'd expect from professional bodies, is apply and maintain professional competence. Now, this is all about acting in the public interest, again, the thing that draws the Royal Statistical Society and other organisations like the ASA and actuaries together, by acting as a professional. It must mean something to be a professional, and that implies that we try and keep to adopt best practice. We try and keep our competence up to date by continuing professional development. We comply with relevant legal requirements and professional codes. So this includes understanding the sources of error and bias in models, using clean data, making sure that our methods are appropriate for the questions that are being asked, and balancing the benefits of the work against any risks. And then, not when work's been done, we don't just forget about it, we then review and have a monitoring cycle. So we continually reviewing, making sure that our models are up to date and that we can do better. So we follow relevant professional and regulatory practices. We ensure that the business's ethics, policies, procedures and governance is applied to data science work. And we try and follow best practices as a sort of summary goal. The fourth theme is about maintaining public confidence. So this is all about the public. Will the public trust people with their data? And we all have a duty, I think, working in data science, artificial intelligence, to try and enhance that. If we work by considering ethical principles throughout all stages of the project, if we're transparent and honest about what we're doing in the communications, and we engage widely with a diverse group of stakeholders, including people who might actually not like what we're doing, if you talk to them at an early stage and try and overcome their objections and convince them that you actually are thinking about it, then you're far more likely to increase confidence. And that should help, because the public will then be more willing to share their data. So example practices include engaging with the appropriate ethical bodies, avoiding unnecessary complexity in models, building trust through transparent communication with the public. Now, just some examples which I personally think didn't go in that direction. An obvious one is the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal, where I think it was 87 million people's Facebook profiles were available to be used for political advertising. notices. They weren't all in the US, but most of them in the US. And that was without their consent. Facebook was eventually fined $5 billion by the Federal Trade Commission, and they were also fined £500,000 in the UK. It's a much smaller amount, but that's because that was the maximum that was maximum fine before GDPR came in. Arguably also the Metropolitan Police has been acting in a way that was a bit premature. They used facial recognition software recently, which was shown to be very inaccurate. It I think had a success rate of about 19%. So
When you say success rate, there are obviously two areas, false positives and false negatives. What do you mean by success rate of 19%?
well, they dispute the figures, but I think they had some academics look at it, and there were matches that they found, and only 8 out of 42 were actually correct. So most of them were false
So
positives.
Okay, so that's a true positive rate, but you don't know the true negative rate.
No. I mean, basically, it was done badly as well. They arrested somebody who objected to someone wanted to cover their face because they didn't want to take part in this program. And then it turned out this program wasn't very good anyway. So that's, that will have diminished confidence. Another example is that about a couple of years ago, IBM's Watson for oncology, which is cancer treatment, has faced criticism because it was over-promising. It was sort of saying, yes, we really make huge strides. And actually, it turned out that it was overly biased towards US patients, than most of the data was, and US methods of care, which are not always appropriate in other parts of the world. And it was also very heavily dependent on the recommendations of one hospital, a very eminent hospital with very eminent clinicians. But it wasn't so much machine learning. It was so that will have set back the cause of AI in medicine, unfortunately. I don't know what's happened since then. So the final principle is maintaining accountability and oversight. And this comes back to that quote by Stephen Hawking. If we don't maintain control, it could be disastrous. So we need to be mindful of how and when we are delegating decision-making to systems, and we need governance in place to ensure that systems deliver the intended objectives. So we need to understand and explain the potential implications to avoid introducing advanced AI systems that do not have adequate governance. And by advanced AI systems, I mean super intelligent AI that we cannot understand and is clever enough to outthink us. And from a professional point of view, we should note that delegating decisions to systems doesn't actually take away our individual responsibilities, whether we're a practitioner or an executive. So, some quotes about that. Stephen Hawking, in the short term, it depends on who controls it, so which country essentially. And China has said that it wants to lead the world in AI by 2030. But the long-term impact depends on whether we can actually control it. Can we actually, we summon the demon, can we actually control it? I'm an optimist about AI. I think we can do things, but we have to be really careful. Now, if you're not concerned about AI safety, you should be, because it's more risky than North Korea. That's Elon Musk. The astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, we should start behaving now, because when, he says not if, but when artificial intelligence becomes our overlord, then it'll have less reason to get rid of us. We humans steer the future not because we're the strongest, but because we're the smartest on the planet. So when there is something smarter than us, again it's when, not if, it will rule over us. That's less optimistic. Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, like people including Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk, I agree that the future is scary, very bad for people. If we build these devices to take care of everything for us, eventually they'll think faster than us, and they'll get rid of us slow humans to run companies more efficiently. Okay, so this is, as Rochelle said, it's complex. So we've got these 5 principles, but when you put it into practice, it's much harder. So the full guide, this is just a summary of it. It's a condensed outline of the available information, but it's still quite long. So we've also wanted to provide a checklist that people can refer to within the different parts of the project cycles. It's still in draft, as I mentioned, but because we've just got final discussions with our regulator, the actuaries regulator. The RSS doesn't have the same regulator, but this is a sneak peek at through the 5 main stages of the work. So when we're planning the project, we need to think about the big picture. Is it in the public interest? How might value be distributed fairly? Again, that's the first principle. Try and increase societal good. Don't forget about some groups. If you can, share the good. Can the data be ethically sourced? What are the risks? And the 4th principle of getting trust and communication. Engage with public stakeholders, seek early feedback, and get the governance right. That's the 5th principle. And then when you're actually managing the data, we need to get the consent right and the legal uses at the start. We need good data security measures in place to avoid the data being leaked. And again, training our staff so that it's not just a few people, but everyone who comes in contact with the data needs to know about the importance of the privacy and security. We need to think about bias and error. Have we got a sample that's missing? Is it, for example, only people who have access to mobile phones? Therefore, there's a whole structure of society who don't have that, and they will not be represented. What can we do about that? Professional competence, well, all sort of usual things. Best practices, data cleaning, detecting, mitigating sources of bias, peer review, if we can, quality assurance. The analysis and development, we've got to make sure that we're using the work data in the way that it is actually within our consent that we've got from the people. Monitor the risks. We try to minimise complexity in models and validating thoroughly. We communicate with stakeholders by explaining the outcomes and the limitations of the model. And when we're delivering it, we are transparent about what we've done and what decisions we've delegated to the machines. We share where possible. Ideally, we share everything. Now, that's a very difficult thing in commercial work, but if you can have your models so that other people can play around with them, they can see the data, they can run them, that would be the ideal. And try and apply best practice in anonymisation. I think that's a very difficult area, but there are ways of encrypting things that there are newer ways which are coming out, which I want to look into. And then the final bit is the communication and oversight. So this comes back to building up trust. We've got to be honest and objective when communicating on our work. Again, we saw how difficult that is with commercial pressures. And engaging with the public again to build up trust. So the next step is that the final version is due to be launched on 7th of October at Errol Street, the RSS headquarters in London, and the RSS president will be speaking, and our president, John Taylor, will be speaking as well. And I think the Ada Lovelace Institute are sponsoring today's Ethics in AI. Carly Kind, the director, will be speaking, and Jenny Tennyson, chief executive of the Open Data Institute. So there'll be panel discussion, a drinks reception. So if you're interested, please do come on. And we'll need again, as being professional organisations, we will need to keep this guidance under review. Once it's been finalised, we will be reminding people and asking people for regular feedback. So these are some questions that that exercise me particularly. So if we have time, I'd be very interested in your views. How do we balance the privacy, the need for privacy, against the good that could come from wider sharing of data? I'm thinking particularly of medical uses. So, for example, the millions dead quote is an estimate arising from, there were some premature deaths from side effects of an approved drug in the US. There were 25,000 premature deaths just from one drug. And this is because the data was in small chunks because of legislation that made it very difficult for different medical areas to share the data. And this Ben Taylor chap who's written about this, he's got a personal interest because one of his close family members suffers from a rare disease. And it took a long time for this rare disease to be diagnosed. Again, because the data pools are too small, or much smaller than they could be if privacy concerns could be overridden or got round by good agreement of people. So there's this conflict. If you can share with a much larger data set, you will find far more cases, make it easier for a deep learning model to identify a rare disease, whereas in practice it can take several years before clinicians who've never seen this thing actually find it. And IBM's Watson to oncology, it may only have data for, say, 10,000 patients for lung cancer, which isn't very much for a deep learning algorithm. But if you could extend the data pool, I mean, if you just think what you could do, if you could get worldwide anonymized medical data, that's probably a pipe dream. But there is this conflict between privacy, the need to keep people's data safe, but also the good that could be done by sharing data, a larger set of data. Second point, how do we actually balance explainability, which is something that GDPR says that we have to explain decisions to customers. Why is the insurance premium gone up, or why my credit card balance being declined, or my payment? How do we balance that against these using deep learning algorithms which have sometimes millions of parameters, sometimes hundreds of millions of parameters, which is very hard for a human, even someone who's an expert in the domain, to understand. Just comprehending thousands and thousands of parameters is difficult, let alone millions. And yet, these deep learning algorithms are winning the day in several areas. For example, in playing
Flu
Go.
prediction.
Sorry?
Flu prediction. Google flu prediction is a good example, isn't it?
What, they got that wrong?
Exactly.
Yeah. Now,
Deep learning.
but I mean, this is in some areas it gets it wrong. If you look at, say, Go, and AlphaGo 0 beat AlphaGo, which is beating humans. Okay. So I mean there is a balance there. How do we prevent an AI arms race? You think back to the 1940s when the Germans were trying to develop nuclear weapons, so were the US, and if it goes the wrong way, huge consequences. Now, if all countries agree that Google have said, for example, they will not work on weapons, on automated advanced AI weaponry. But if all countries don't agree to that sort of thing, and all companies don't agree, how do you actually stop one country getting super autonomous weapons? How do we, perhaps the most important, is how do we manage the transition if several people are right that AI is going to take over jobs eventually? If you have a situation where robots and AI can do a job 365 days a year, no holiday, no sickness. Yes, a computer might go down because of a server failure, but you can back it up in the cloud and just switch to another one. So it's almost 99% uptime. Why would a company pay a human to do anything? How do we manage to transition to an economy where companies employ machines rather than us? So if you want to discuss these with me, I'm very delighted to hear from you. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a blog, pjv.net as well. If you search for me on LinkedIn, you'll find me there. Delighted to take any questions and comments.
You mentioned bias in the data a few times, and just with the AI machine learning making decisions for people, one of the kind of fears I have of becoming more is the data itself having not statistical biases but societal biases within it, and those becoming more entrenched. Is that within your definition of biases within the data, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the data that's all been collected is of affluent Western societies or of mainly of men, because men have worked more in industries in the past, then there's a bias against women, there's a bias against ethnic minorities. And it's very hard to avoid bias in historical data because historical data reflects society.
I don't mean that kind of coverage issue. I mean, everyone is covered, but just now, like if you were to say what income should you expect to a university graduate, I would say you'll expect less just because you're female, and that's obviously not a society that we want, but that's how AI would drive that, and then they would expect that. So how do you kind of think that needs to be overcome in AI and the data sources that AI uses?
Well, I mean, I haven't got practical experience of this personally, but what I understand is that people look at the results that are predicted by the AI for different groups and check that if there's a disparity, that there's a good reason for it. It's not just because of bias that's inherent in what's happened so far. You know, in insurance, for example, we're not allowed to charge different premiums for men and women if it's the same experience. But if you look at, say, driving a car, if you put the devices that track how driving's done, then if you've got two men and women with exactly the same driving experience, then they'll get the same premium. But if you get a situation where young men accelerate more and brake more than a young woman, then the young man will be charged more because it's more risky driving. So there are ways to the technology to balance the difference in behaviour. It's a difficult area. I think this is what we're talking about. You have to look at what the outcomes are from the model and say, is this justifiable? Can we understand it? And it comes back to explainability. How can we understand it if it's a huge neural network? And from a statistical point of view, of course, there's always the data overfitting. So this is something else that bothers me: is how do you get estimates of the significance of the parameters when you've got thousands or millions of parameters for a neural network model? So sometimes a simpler model is better from the point of explainability, but then you come up against this in terms of image recognition. Deep learning models have got better than humans in competition. So it's you balance the performance against the explainability, and that's a huge problem. And bias and that's really hard to deal with when you've got unexplainable models. But I think we're faced with how do we can't just cut our nose off to say we're not going to have unexplainable models.
A couple of questions. Did you spend any time looking at the standards required for medical drugs and devices? Because my experience, limited experience of the actuarial and accountancy profession, is they have no standards of data quality. Whereas in Europe, if you're trying to get a drug license, you can't play the kind of games of saying, well, 23% of the data isn't accurate, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that was only on a small pension fund of a few billion. And what do you mean by you are subject to technical actuarial standards? What does that actually mean?
Well, it means in practice that if an actuary prepares a report and that makes decisions, the actuary has to certify that they have complied.
And if they don't comply?
Then they can be disciplined.
Well, not according to your own disciplinary office. Your own disciplinary office wrote to me that failure to meet technical actuarial standards does not constitute misconduct. I'm quoting your own office, the Institute of Actuaries.
Well, I'm not aware of that particular case, but if you please contact me afterwards. I mean, you know, there are very strict rules on this. In fact, the technical actuarial standards, if it's serious enough, and I think something to do with medical, then the FRC that are overarching regulators.
The FRC takes the same attitude. Breach of technical actuarial standards doesn't constitute misconduct. Doesn't matter if 23% of your data is incorrect. Doesn't matter if your statistical methods are incorrect. It doesn't matter if you don't document anything.
Well,
So you know you can, you know, an actuary can sign off evaluation while saying they don't understand the models that are used in it.
I'm shocked by that, and I'd like to hear more, because that does surprise me, because
Good.
we take
Because
this
that
thing
is
very,
the
very
correct
seriously.
No, you don't take it seriously. It's just been frustrating.
So we have just 5 minutes left, and I'd like to have some closing remarks from you. And can you just let us know about your sort of like where you think you're using RSS approach?
Sure. Hi, for those who know me, I'm Rochelle the Red Echo. That's more for those who don't. I'm not the chair of the PAC. It's kind of like getting Barcelona to come and play, and there's no Leo Messi. But I am here to represent New England Patriots, Tom Brady. Yeah, the same man. Thank you for the talks. Tom did invite me, and he just said, "You don't have to need slides, Rob. Just come and do what you normally do, which is probably just rant a bit for a few minutes." I'm not going to go on for very long. We need to eat our lunches. I'm surprised no one came up with the Avengers Age of Ultron AI example of AI out of control, which is my favourite one. Just to keep it very brief, AI data science, I probably identify more as a data scientist than a statistician now, just as things have evolved. Computational power is higher now. We can do much more ourselves. There's like a real danger from kind of data science and people using these black box techniques. I've kind of got into statistics, I think. I've been involved in the RSS now for 8 years. And I've kind of seen this shift of kind of traditional methods, you know, ways of doing statistics, and when we talk about ethics, how we do things, p-hacking, all those types of things that, you know, you can just see. And now we've come to a kind of stage where we've got black box models, all these techniques that people can just apply to data that they've been collecting for years and years and years. We talk about the ethics of collecting data. We've probably breached a lot of this already. People have been collecting things on their phones for a long, long time. And now we're at a stage where people can kind of use these methods and techniques, and they maybe don't understand them. There aren't always people like us who are here at these events and kind of are interested in this. People think they need to do AI, the AI arms race. I believe kind of that exists in some way. People want to kind of adopt data science. And so what we're talking about today is really important. What the speakers have talked about is very important. And whilst I think it's going to be how we get on with AI, how kind of this develops, I'm not sure where we're going to go and whether it will take over everything. Being aware of what's out there and what we're doing and the kind of limitations to these techniques are really key, and where we can go wrong and people not necessarily knowing what they're doing or being in control of those methods. I can also see the doors are opening at the back, which is probably a great time to stop. That's my kind of remark on it. Thanks, speakers, it's been really good, and I'm glad you spoke for longer and had less of me. If anyone has any comment of what I said, happy to take it. If you just prefer to go and have lunch, thank you very much.